Okay, maybe we can have a, very short entry. We have two very distinguished speakers today, Professor Ahmet İçduygu and Professor Rinus Penninx. This is really an honor to be here because I remember my first postdoctoral project was about Turkish-German transnational space that I worked with Ahmet Hoca 10 years ago. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of this agreement. Now we are celebrating the 60th, and hopefully we will be celebrating the 70th together as well. I'm not going to read the biographies of the speakers to you because I think both names are speaking for themselves. What we are planning to do today is not really like a formal presentation of like 40 minutes each, but we are planning to do rounds, and we really want to keep this in a more of a conversational context. Ahmet Hocam will be mostly presenting the Turkish side of the events, and Rinus will be actually focusing on the European side of the events. Rinus has been actually in the field since 70s. I remember he already told me some of his field stories from the 70s when actually nobody was really very much interested in the subject. So I'm really looking forward to listening to the discussion. So maybe we can start with some history, trying to understand the dynamics and mechanisms behind the origin and continuation of the Turkish migration to Germany, both in the context of initial temporary labor migration, then turning to long-term and permanent settlement. So maybe we can start with Ahmet Hocam and then continue with Rinus. By the way, we will have a Q&A session at the very end, but in the meantime, if the attendees have any questions, they can always write it on the chat box, and I will try to follow as much as possible. Ahmet Hocam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deniz. Yes, let's start with a kind of short history. When we focus on migration flows, migration of people from one country to another, often we discuss two things. One is the origin of how it started, then the continuation of the flows. So briefly, also I will focus on how it started, what were the dynamics and mechanisms behind this continuation since the 1960s. To better understand how the Turkish migration to Europe and to Germany started labor migration, I should start with the statement of that Turkey has undergone remarkable transformation after the Second World War. Just politically, just taking side with the Western countries, the European countries to West, just joining all these different international organizations, but plus get close to the Europe and the US. Why I mentioned that? Because then through the Marshall Plan, for instance, the Turkish economy, particularly Turkish agriculture, very much affected. This money coming from the Marshall Plan just invests into the mechanization in agriculture. Then what we witnessed that particularly then, of course, in 1950, Turkey went into this multi-party system. A liberal party came to power. Together with this external and internal factors, we see a kind of huge changes in the rural areas. Peasants start losing their lands, plus through the mechanization, they start losing their jobs, and there was huge flow started from the rural areas to the urban areas. From the early Republican period up to 1950s, in fact, the changes between the rural and urban population was not so big, actually. Only at the beginning of the Republic, only one in every 10 was living in cities. This did not change very much up to 1940s. Only 20% was living in urban areas. But in the 50s, this proportion rose to the 30, even over 30%, just as a result of this rural to urban migration. But what happened that the urban infrastructure plus the industries not large enough to absorb this labor moving from the rural areas to the urban areas to the industrial sector. A famous sociologist, Mübeccel Kray, she wrote a kind of article mentioning this process, a kind of rapid depeasantization and the slow workerization. So this means that there are people moving from the agriculture, the rural areas to urban, but the industry, they were not becoming a kind of worker because the economy was not good enough just to produce the factories, the industry. Then in 1960, there was a military coup in Turkey, and the new regime actually gave importance to the planning and the state planning organization established. In fact, my research shows that this idea of emigration came from the state planning organization. Those years, it's called a bit the exporting labor, okay, because there's a surplus of the labor, which is not absorbed by the economy. There were high unemployment rates, people looking for job, and also country needs foreign currency. So what is my research and other research shows that the policymakers in Turkey, encouraged by these three reasons, I mean, just thinking that the three benefits will come out of this emigration from Turkey to European countries. One was that, as I said, those years, the country economy was developing, but the country needs foreign currency, and the foreign currency can only come from the export, which is not so high in those years. Tourism, again, which was not environment. The exporting labor, the sending the workers and the getting remittances, this process was a kind of important to get the foreign currency to the country. This is the first thing. And the second thing is that the rising unemployment, then again, workers going abroad will reduce this population pressure coming from the unemployment. Third was what is thought that this is a kind of temporary movement of the labor. And those people, they went to Europe, they will work 2 or 4 years, they will come back with the certain skills gained. Then they can carry this. So almost this is seen as a kind of investment to the human capital of these people. When they return, they will create jobs, plus they will work in the factories. So these were the main three reasons actually state planning organization really planned this, which was a kind of planned from the Turkish side. But when I say planned, I like to say some important note. There were two ways of going to Europe. One was to apply to the Turkish Employment Service. The other way, the employers in Europe, they can name some people and they can invite the people. In the Turkish Employment Service, when they work, these potential migrants, when they apply to go to European countries, they fill a form. But in that form, they ask their age and their employment. There's some information, but there was no information wanted from them which country they want to go. I found this very ironic. So saying that maybe at the conclusion I will come, within the 60 years, of course, it turned into permanent settlement. And many of these workers also, they became this citizen of those countries. Okay. So initially you think that even which country you are going is not important. Important thing is that to find employment either in Germany, in Netherlands or Belgium or Austria, just based on your chance on the list, but later you became the citizen of those countries. Then if I have this, how this process developed. Then in 1970, the idea was temporary migration, a kind of even circulation plan. But then because of the oil crisis of early 1970s, European countries, they stopped the recruitment of the labor, but some of the industries still needed labor there. So some of the workers, they are there, they continue with work. Then the family reunification started. after 1970s, even it starts a bit early. This was also helped to the continuation of the labor from Turkey to Germany and to other European countries. Then there was 1980 military coup. This is less known, but there was a huge number of people, political activists, journalists, the others. I look at the numbers in one of my articles, close to 800,000 Turkish citizens sought asylum starting with 1981 up to 1990s. So there was a kind of another type of migration, asylum seeking also integrated into these flows. Then we will discuss that this, of course, once the family reunification started, children started going to the employment and schooling, and there was a kind of spontaneous integration, I can call, or a kind of, the idea that they're staying more and more, and there was a need for in the economy in European countries for labor, and it continues that way. Probably, did I finish my 10 minutes or almost?
You are just in time, Hocam.
Okay. Maybe I should stop here then, because when we discuss the other issues like the integration issues and what happened later, I will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have mentioned the importance of remittances at the time, as well as decreasing the unemployment rate in Turkey. Rinus, can you tell us more about the motivations and the dynamics on the European side? You have to unmute yourself.
I should have thought about that. I think my story is filling in a number of things that Ahmet has left open. The first thing I want to say is that labor migration starts always basically as an economic-driven phenomenon, and it's demand and supply on the labor market, but start from the idea that it is demand that is decisive on what happens. It's quite clear in the case of Germany and Turkey. In Germany, that had started already before Turkey came in as a country for recruitment. Germany, in rebuilding the country after the war, was so successful that they needed workers for the lowest paid and the work in the country. And they first started to attract Italians and Spaniards and whatever, the nearby countries. And it was only when there were too little Italians and Spaniards coming that Germany started to recruit or to fill in relations with Turkey and to use the very small relations that they had with Turkey in the beginning of the 1960s. Young people who came to Germany for a stage and that kind of stuff. And that was built into a system of recruitment. So it's a very good idea to look at this particular labor migration as originated in a demand in Germany. And then, at least that's from the perspective of Germany looking at it. So the beginning is always this demand. If that had not been there, and if there had been enough Italians and Spaniards, it would not have reached Turkey. So it's important to realize that. But what happens if that system comes into play? Then you look at all the interests that are involved in that system. Firstly, there are the employers, because they are the ones who have created these possibilities and have started to get in these workers. They have negotiated with the government to make that an official system, because these were foreigners and had to be admitted to the country. And then, of course, in the German circumstances, there were all other interest groups coming in, like the trade unions, who said, okay, you might want to bring in workers, but only on certain conditions, on the conditions that there is no native worker available for the job, and secondly, on the same conditions as workers in Germany. And that was a very interesting and let's say important trait of the system, because the labor migration system at that time was a rather balanced and controlled system. And I say this because I made this comparison with what has recently taken place in Europe, which is the Eastern European migration to Western Europe, which is completely uncontrolled, within a very liberal kind of economic climate, in which recruiters and commercial networks have kind of made possible the very intensive kind of labor migration of low-paid and uncontrolled work in Western Europe. In a way, I'm saying that the labor migration system that came into existence in the beginning of the 60s in Europe, from Germany, the Netherlands, etc., was a much more controlled system than we have at the moment, which also meant that workers were relatively in a better situation. Of course, they were recruited only for the work that was not good enough for the natives. So, in a way, this is the double picture of what happens at the beginning. So Turkey was last in the row of recruitment countries from the perspective of Germany. That was important because the other countries did not deliver enough workers at that time. And it was important that it was done in a very controlled way. It was also clear that in that system, it was meant as a temporary migration. And that had long-time consequences. And the point is that such a labor migration system, which is purely based on demand and defined as an economic thing, becomes a social issue as soon as workers are involved. As soon as workers are in Germany and there is a crisis and they won't go back, and when they're long in Germany, part of them will bring their families. So you get a labor migration system in which there is an increasing social aspect to it, and an increasing say of workers themselves of what the outcome of the system is. And then Germany, of course, and the other countries in Western Europe realized that in the course of time, it was still defined as a temporary labor migration system, but the part that settled permanently and the number of family reunifications was increasing until at the end of the system, when the economic crisis of the 72-73 struck, the oil crisis. At that moment, it was possible to stop the recruitment, but it was not possible to influence significantly the number of people that were already in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Sweden, because they had their residence permits, they could not be sent back, they had build up their rights and so on, build up their social environment, and quite a number of them did not react to the return policies that Germany had in the second half of the 70s and 80s. Germany, of course, still defined it as a temporary labor migration, but it had become in the 15 years between 60 and 75 into a part of the German population. Of course, this is selective because quite a lot of people, Turkish migrants, have come to Germany and have returned. So the outcome is that you end up in a system that leaves consequences both in Turkey of quite a number of people who have spent a time in Turkey, or in Germany, but also quite a group that settles more and more, that brings the family to Germany or the Netherlands, and builds up a Turkish community within the rural area, for example, in which there are quite some concentrations of these groups. And then you get, let's say, the difficult thing of what started as a labor migration movement becomes a permanent settled immigrant group that is not defined as part of the receiving society. And that's where in Germany, of course, the discussion started in the 1990s on, let's say, is Germany an immigration country or not? And that discussion took 10 years. And the commission of 2002 that ultimately pleaded for a definition of Germany as being an immigration country, and then look at these people who had been defined as temporary, with a lot of consequences for their practical integration in society, only after 2005. So this history of labor migration turned into something quite else. And you can only follow that if you not only look at the economic part of it, but also look at the social part. What does it mean for both the Germans, but also for this particular group in terms of how they settle in Germany? What does it mean culturally? Ahmet was clear in saying it was not only the labor migration that at a certain moment led to the fact that Germany receives quite a lot of political refugees. If Germany did not have had the labor migrants and relations, it would not have so many Turks that fled in 1980, the coup in Turkey. They would not have such a big Kurdish community. So in a way, I think we should look at labor migration systems in how they develop into systems that are more than economic systems alone. If we really want to understand what happens and what consequences it has for both the descending country and the receiving country. Maybe that's enough as an initial statement.
Exactly. I think we can actually focus on two more questions moving on from here. Maybe the first part is how does this labor migration initially had an effect on this on development? I mean, looking at the migration development linkage, Rinus has I think it is a very good article, a critical review of theory and practice, the case of Turkey. Some of the findings are still valid for today. Ahmet Hoca as well has looked at human development in Turkey in the sense of this migration as well. So maybe we can first look at this migration development linkage and then moving on to the social part in the third round, looking at integration. Ahmet Hocam, would you like to take the floor now?
Okay, thank you. As I mentioned that from the perspective of the Turkish policymakers, in the early 60s, when this whole program of the guest worker program started, the main idea was that how this will contribute to the development of the country behind, with the remittances I already mentioned, then the foreign currency arriving through the remittances, plus the unemployment will decline, and also the because of the circulation or because of the return of the workers, in fact, those workers will gain certain skills and they will apply that in Turkey, and this will contribute to the development of the country. In that context, actually, what we see that there was a return process of the in the 60s up to mid 70s. Actually, there are different numbers, but over nearly 1.5 million somehow it's considered the return, but there was a circulation, but quite a kind of large portion also returned, but some of them later arrived to Europe. So exactly it's difficult to get the figure about the exact figure, but there was a significant number of returns. So when we consider that, in fact, then I will come to how the individual migrants, they invested and what happened to them. But also I like to mention the government programs. For instance, central bank is the Turkish central bank was very unique in that sense. The workers in Europe, they were able to open a bank account in our central bank. This system was because to keep the foreign currency in the bank. This went over the decades, actually, up to even the 1990s. Later, because cost of, and this central bank was offering the high interest rate for their investment. Plus, there were some bank arrangements, the kind of joint programs, but the state and the state-owned banks, they try to get the saving of the these workers and to make them to channel to the some industries. Actually, we see that in different regions, like for instance in Denizli, there were some regions in Turkey, actually they were mostly, in fact, they were the places most of these people they are living, the villages, like Denizli, Yozgat, for instance. In those places, we see that type of investment, in fact, both with the help of the governments. But overall, what we can argue that the management of the government was not so successful in terms of channeling this money to the productive fields in economy. In the literature, often said that, although what I will say, I partly agree and partly disagree, it is said that those investments or the remittances often went to the consumption of the people. Of course, consumption also a part of the economy. So maybe we should not approach from that perspective, just arguing that they buy the household goods, etc. But this did not turn a kind of investment in turning a kind of industries, etc. In that sense, actually, in the literature, we see that Nermin Abadanunat also argues that, I mean, when we look at the overall gain out of this, the concept of exporting labor, although measurement is very difficult, but the argument could be that the certain regions benefited out of that, localities, the villages, the towns, but it is also considered that this contribution was limited in terms of, again, I'm repeating myself, but turning a kind of productivity of this this return was not so high. But what we may argue that of course, many of those returnees, for instance, instead of going to their villages, they move to the cities. This creates a kind of opportunity, of course, for their children to go to the schools. This was a kind of part of the also development. Plus, we know that, for instance, in terms of the position of the woman, actually, a kind of how this migration contribute to the position of women. There are so many studies that what we see that those households where there were workers working abroad, the status of women in those households, in fact, improved. So in that sense, probably the social contribution of the whole event, whole issue was quite significant. Plus, not only in terms of the development in Turkey, but these flows contributed to the political activism. Also, we should not forget that particularly in the destination countries, how the Islamist movement and in fact the Kurdish movement somehow, because those migrants, in fact, they benefited relatively democratic environment of those countries, and in that sense, actually, I can also argue that the development of the concept of the civil society somehow benefited from this flow. maybe I should stop here. Actually, what I just to pass the words to Rinus. Of course, Rinus with Nermin Abadan Unat, they conducted this research in Boğazlı and Yozgat. In fact, probably from him we can hear that how, for instance, from a kind of small locality like in a town, how it operated and whether it contributed to the development or not. Last point, of course, one point probably I forgotten to mention. When we discussed in migration studies, development and the migration linkage, one is that we can argue that to what extent the migration contributes to the development of the origin country. But the other thing is that the migration, the development itself also may contribute to the extra migration. So there's a kind of effect of this emigration to the development, but that development also contributes to the mobilization of some other migrants, potential migrants to go abroad. Also, we should not forget this two-way relation between migration and development. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you, Hocam. Rinus, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, I will be complimentary to what Ahmet said. My first remark is that when I started to do research in Turkey on the social and economic consequences of the export of labor from certain regions, and I did this research in Boğazlı district in the province of Yozgat, we had ideas about how that contribution to the region of origin could possibly take place. And exactly that was what Ahmet formulated, that the state planning organization expected in the 1960s when they defined their labor export strategies. It would give a gain of remittances. Money goes back and can be spent. It would give a gain of people who were not, who were unemployed, and would enlighten, would make lighter the problems of the labor market, but at the same time could possibly bring in new experience of working in an industrial country back to the region if possible. And in that way it would contribute. With these ideas we started to do that research. What we concluded afterwards is that we have, if we want to look at gains and losses, we firstly have to look at the question whose gains and whose losses, at what level. Now, the first level is that of the individual and the household. And it's quite clear that some of them have gained a lot by going away as a household and as an individual. It's also clear that some of them lost quite a bit because many of these expeditions were not successful. But we don't hear about them. But go back to the region and interview these old people and they can tell you about 3-4 times travel attempts that did not, and in which they lost quite a lot of investments for which they had sold part of their work before, etc. So the picture is gains and losses. Some of them lost and some of them gained. The same holds for the region. But the region is more problematic. It depends very much on what kind of region you're in. Part of the Boğazlı region was completely emptied at that time. Some of the villages, all of the able-bodied men were away. It meant there was, well, the consequence was that the development that took place there was that the arable land was worked by 1 or 2 people who bought a tractor and could do that automatically. But there were no farmers anymore. And when they came back, they did not come back to the village, but went back to the city nearby. So they went either to Yozgat or to Kayseri or whatever, and started to do something else. Now the question is, in whose interests is that development? The same holds for, say, Turkey as a country. There are a number of things that are beneficial, getting money in. But as Ahmet said, well, you have to negotiate that with the Turkish community. We know from studies at that time that the Turkish workers in Germany were very reluctant to put their money on Turkish banks because inflation was huge in Turkey. So that's why they first gained the opportunity to have accounts that kept the Dutch mark in Dutch mark and not in Turkish lira. So that would move them away from the inflation. But still, they were very hesitant to put their money from Germany. They had much more money in Germany than on Turkish banks. So you see that the interests of the different groups at different levels do contradict each other. And that's what that in the outcome, when we finished our study in Turkey, we said, well, the picture, if you really want to see the influence of, in particular the economic influence, you have to study it on the different levels, make conclusions on these different levels, and on the aggregate, you get a very confused, complete picture. One of the interesting examples was 2 initiatives that were taken by migrants themselves to stimulate development in the region of origin. The first were these joint stock corporations, İçduygu they were called, in which migrants bought shares. And with that money, they started a leather factory in Devecipinar in one of the, and that was the way they thought they would contribute to the development. The fate is that this development has ended in a complete failure. There were hundreds of initiatives. There were hundreds of shares sold. There were initiatives taken. There were only 2 or 3 successful. And those who were successful were taken over within a few years by the stock market and were not governed by the migrants anymore. So what is that? Village development cooperatives was the same thing. Yeah? The state was very clever in saying, well, we give a priority for people who are a member of a village development cooperative to go to Europe in the recruitment system, assuming that they would invest in the village development cooperative in order to stimulate development in the region of origin. The fact was that many people became member of the village development cooperative in order to get the priority to get out, but did not invest any. So both movements attempts to stimulate this development at a regional level were a failure, a complete failure. That was quite clear. And that's why I mentioned this, because we very often have these very simple ideas, and in the discussion nowadays also saying that labor migration can be an advanced thing. We have much too simple ideas of how we define development in that case. Development for whom, for at what level, etc. And it often does not live. The remittances works, that's quite clear. It means that national economies get more foreign currency to buy, etc. So, but that's a trade effect rather than something else. What is important, I would say, in terms of migration and development is to look at the long-term consequences of what I call a system, a migration system that comes into existence with all kinds of relations involved, with not only people going from to the labor market and go back, but having social consequences in terms of populations that are here and there. These populations have relations, and they may start like in Germany, and they may start enterprises in Germany and the Netherlands, and very often they take contact with the Turkish economy. Now, if you look at trade relations between the Netherlands and Turkey, or Germany and Turkey, they have grown and multiplied in the same order as the Turkish population in these countries has grown. And in the last decades, it has even multiplied because the second generation in the Netherlands and Germany, who very often are entrepreneurs, have done a lot of business with Turkey in the field of trade. Cultural relations in the same way, political relations also, like Ahmet said, the coup of 1980 caused a lot of migration from specific political refugees to Germany and the Netherlands. Then they built up a cultural environment which stimulated cultural relations between the two countries. So we should look at the system as a whole that develops in the course of time, and then we see the consequences, and then we see a mixed picture. And we also see that part of the population contributes a lot to these, but another part of the population does not. So it's a very diffuse kind of outcome, in my view.
Thank you, Rinus. I think it is very interesting what you said about the failed attempts, because I remember when we first did our Transnet project with Ahmet Hocam 10 years ago, as I said, there were actually many stories of failures, but as you said, the literature doesn't seem to be focusing on them much.
We have this beautiful book on it, which has the title, what was it? Gurbet, Mihnet ve 3 kuruşluk servet.
3 kuruşluk servet.
That's actually what it says, the outcome was, we put a lot of energy into it, but the outcome was very, very small.
Thank you. Now that we have focused more on the economic aspect, maybe we can move on to elaborate more on the social part, like integration issues. I don't know, I think we will also have a kind of a mixed picture there, but I'm looking forward to hear your views. Ahmet Hocam.
Thank you, Deniz. Well, let me just, as a background, when we refer to integration issue, again, we have to refer to whole movement starts as a kind of temporary migration. And in the first 15, 20 years, this temporariness was very much at the center. Like now we are debating the similar things actually in the refugee case, like in Syrians. When the migrants themselves in a situation, in an environment of this temporariness, in fact, what we see that, of course, one day, the idea is one day they will return. Then what we see that their investment, particularly in terms of their investment in the sense that the integration, like the establishing their life there, sending for instance, children to the school, etc., that type of view, could be time to them secondary. What became important that as early as possible to earn money. So in that sense, for instance, we see that the particular first generation migrants, when they also have their families back, often their children went to the limited school, but mostly they went into the labor market to sell their labor and to have more money into the family budget than, because the investment was important. In fact, what we observed that the buying houses or lands and the investing, have a kind of investment in Turkey. These ideas very, very central in the 1960s and even the mid 70s towards the 80s. So I will stress that this whole issue of temporariness at the beginning could be seen as a kind of factor why the Turkish migrant workers had the kind of integration difficulties. I should put that. From the other side also this applies. From the German side also, in fact, this is seen as Rinus mentioned that until early 2000s, in fact, Germany was very reluctant to call them as the migrants. rather than first in the 70s, even 80s, they are called the workers, then even the Turks, rather than a kind of giving a kind of immigrant status to them. As you know that when we discuss the integration issues, we also discuss, for instance, the very latest and the kind of top point of the integration to get the citizenship. As you know that the whole German system, German nationalism as a kind of ethno-nationalism. So being German is very important, that getting German citizenship was very difficult, and still it is difficult. A bit, of course, in 2000s, there are liberal views, but still, for instance, not accepting the dual citizenship plus the giving the German citizenship is a kind of in a difficult way. So why I told story that from the both sides, there's this structural element in this whole story of the Turkish migration to Germany from both sides, actually, either particularly seeing is temporary, was a kind of obstacle to have a kind of integration policies we had only in the case of Germany in the 2000s, late 1990s, when the Germany somehow officially and half accepted the country turned to a kind of country of immigration. When we refer to also the integration issues, integration is a kind of multifaceted phenomena. What I mean is that we can talk about the integration, the economy in labor market, culturally, socially, politically. So these are different things, but of course they are linked to each other. From economic point of view, of course, these are there's a heterogeneity in Turkish migrant groups, but still these are the workers, a kind of working class people, and often they work since the beginning. They work, not all of them, but majority of them, what we may call that this 3D jobs, difficult, dirty. For instance, particularly early period mining. Okay, they work in the mining industry plus the car industry. Later also, of course, mining industry just came down, but what we observe that they are almost, there's a kind of dual labor market somehow. Most of the migrant workers, particularly we are talking about the German and Turks, they are almost locked into a kind of a group of work. This a kind of social mobility, upward mobility was a bit limited. Of course, we should make distinction between the first and second and third generation migrants. Particularly, again, for the first generation migrants, I don't want to repeat myself, but I will refer to this temporariness issue. Because of this temporariness, second, I believe that, and we know from this research that the second generation also very much affected, having the less education and mostly in early ages going into the workforce and often to the factories and to these 3D jobs. But over time, of course, with the emergence of the third generation, we are seeing that also a kind of upward mobility for third generation we are observing. This is quite visible. Research shows that for instance, I remember the Ayhan research somewhere. I cannot remember exactly which book, but for instance, many of the third generation Turks actually, they know the third language, which is English, etc. So we see that the community is changing over time. Looking from the German side, but as I said, the German nation understanding of nationhood is a bit based on the ethno understanding. So in that sense, what we are observing that a kind of culturalist approach often starting with 1990s also, of course, Germany has this, not only Germany, other countries, starting with 1990s, there is a new racist increase in the neo-racist movements. The Turks actually 1990s suffer out of that. Then, of course, with the 9/11, we should also look from the global side that with the 9/11, of course, Islamophobia rose around the world, and the Turks particularly very much affected in Germany in that sense. Overall, we observe that there is a kind of segregation of the Turkish communities. Geographically, Kreuzberg is a kind of good example, but certain neighborhoods. But again, from literature, we can argue that when we look at the whole integration debate in Germany, it turns to a bit very culturalist approach, almost a kind of assimilationist approach. What I mean that to be German, the idea is, I mean, if you are being German, really you should be German. Language, of course, for integration is important. I mean, and which affects all this employment and the integration to the labor market, the others. But overall, again, looking at this whole picture, what I will stress that probably we should look at the whole integration issue from a kind of multifaceted approach, rather than just believing some mainstream arguments that as I said, language is important, but we should not, for instance, reduce the whole discussion to the knowledge of the language there. So an issue of being inclusiveness, in fact, somehow quite poor in the policies of Germany. Of course, I'm talking relatively. You know that the Turkish migrants not only living in Germany, we have the Netherlands, we have France, more recently UK and the Scandinavian countries. What we observe that those countries' historical approach to the migrants, their concept of nationhood, etc., very much determining to how they develop the certain integration policies. The last point, actually, probably I will come to in the final part, but I like to touch upon here that also what affects this integration process is a bit also diaspora policies of Turkey too, particularly starting with 1980s. Turkish diaspora policies, government policies, diaspora policies very much politicized, let me put that way, because we know that the rising of the Kurdish movement and Islamist movement, the identity politics within these communities, they're very high, and even those the other hot topics like the Armenian question, demonstration, etc., became very important. And the Turkish government tried to create a kind of control over these communities, like the Diyanet, the other organizations. This should be also seen a part of the discussion of the integration too, I believe. Maybe just in the later part of this discussion, I can come to that point. Okay, thank you. Maybe I should stop here again.
Thank you, Hocam. Rinus, I remember reading your book. I think it was the volume with Peter Scholten you wrote. In Turkey nowadays, with the arrival of Syrians, we are also discussing the concept of integration more and more, and we are usually looking at it as a two-way dimension. I mean, both the refugees integrating into the Turkish society and Turkish society integrating into the Syrians' habits and living styles as well. But I remember in the book you had a third dimension. You were not only focusing on the two communities, but you also involved the state's policies, both the sending and receiving countries into the discussion. So it was very, very interesting. So I don't know, maybe you would like to take it from there.
Yeah, which means that I first asked myself the question, what is integration? And I define integration as becoming an accepted part of society. And that means that there's a strong role of the receiving society on the decision to make the newcomer part of that society. And that's, the guest worker thing makes it completely clear. What happened in the first period in Germany from the 60s up till the end of the 1990s, up till the turn of the century, is that they defined these newcomers as guest workers. That means temporary members of society. They did not need to be integrated except for work, because that was the reason why they came. So the segment of integration, becoming an accepted part of society, was limited to work. That's where they were asked for. All the other things were not important. It meant that the German policies up till the turn of the century were that these people were there. We are not an immigration country. They should not become a permanent part of our population. So we do not give them the opportunity to do so. And that has a lot of consequences. That was quite different from what the Netherlands and Sweden did in that same period. From the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, these countries said, okay, we brought them here as temporary migrants, but obviously they stay and we can't remove them. So let us make them full-fledged citizens of our country as soon as possible, because otherwise we get minorities, we get people in a low socioeconomic position and culturally different, which makes them a problematic group in society. That was the start of Dutch integration policy, which means that you're doing a lot in the field of, let's say, political participation. You make it easier to become a citizen. You make it easier to participate in a political system, for example, by giving them rights in local elections, and of course, if they are naturalized also in national elections and so on. Give them more rights in the trade unions, in whatever organization that we have. But also socially and culturally, accept a number of things that are, if we accept 4 strains of Protestantism in Germany, why should we add Islam or as a possibility for, let's say, the public manifestation of unequal set? All these things were absent in Germany. And that has a lot of consequences for, let's say, the possibilities of this new group to become an accepted part of that society. It's not the individual Germans and their acceptance. It's the structural way that a society limits the opportunities of newcomers to become an accepted part of that society. That's what I think is important. Now, we see in the history that only around the millennium, there was this Süssmuth Commission in Germany that brought together the major interest groups in Germany, so employers, trade unions, all NGOs, in asking the questions, actually we are an immigration country, and what does that mean in terms of opportunities that we give for the newcomers to become part of our society? Now, this is all about integration, stimulated or not stimulated. And my view is that in Germany, the integrating forces until the turn of the millennium were actually NGOs like Arbeiterwohlfahrt, like the trade unions, and churches, but not the government. The government still looked at them as being temporary migrants. So what you see is a very ambivalent kind of policies with ambivalent results. That's quite clear. It, on the one hand, meant that in Germany, more than in the Netherlands, you had concentrations of Turks which created their own communities with their own rules, with their own institutions, with their own religions and so on, much more than in the Netherlands as a consequence of these policies. The effect of all these policies in terms of integration in the long run, let's say after the 60 years that we are now kind of looking at the consequences, is that the picture is very diverse and very confused. It seems sometimes that the dominant picture is that there are that integration actually ended up in ethnic segregation in Germany. And to a certain extent, for those who only see that part, it's right. But there is a lot of selective kind of thing. Because at the same time, we see that there is quite a large group of people of Turkish descent that has made big positions in German society accepted. In the Netherlands, even more. In the Netherlands, it's, for example, the number of people of Turkish origin chosen in the national parliament is higher than their percentage of the population. So in the political acceptance is by opening the possibilities and by having the NGOs in the political field being convinced that it is worthwhile to integrate these communities politically in the Netherlands, also by being chosen. You have these possibilities. In Germany, you saw that the first one who was chosen, John, was the one who's coming from the trade unions. and that was, he could not come through the political means because they were closed in Germany. So what I want to say is that the outcome is very diverse. We tend to see the failure of integration, which ends up in segregation, which certainly exists among Turks in Germany. Very close Turkish community in which Turkish is the main language, and even in the third generation there is a strong orientation on. But there is also a huge community that is accepted in Germany, that has positions, etc., which we do not see anymore as of Turkish descent. So we have to be a little bit cautious to have a judgment on the non-integration as being rather complete. I think the picture in Germany is very diverse. There is a strong group that ends up in a segregated situation. There is a strong group that's very successful in trade, in all kinds of things. And there is a small in-between group. That's the picture that we have in the Netherlands. The elite among people of Turkish descent is quite big. They're in media, they're in business. Corendon Airlines is a famous guest worker who built up this whole Turkish industry, who built up relations between Germany and Turkey and the Netherlands and Turkey by creating a tourist industry in which Germans go to Turkey. It's interesting to see this as a consequence of labor migration systems which turn into larger systems of relations in which all kinds of things happens, and through which we look at development in a little bit different way, in a more complete way than only the very limited kind of economic model that we have. So my conclusion is that there are strong variations among, let's say, the integration measure of Turks in Germany. There is a part clearly visible that is pretty much segregated from German society, but there is also a big part that is well integrated and has position and is accepted in German society, and a relatively small group in between. That's fine. It's the same by the way, for the Moroccan immigrant group in the Netherlands. The extremes are quite. Our chair of the National Parliament, who was a woman of Moroccan origin, which is quite exceptional. So you may have these things after 50 years, in which the results in integration go two ways, and we are inclined to see only the visible non-segregation and not see the very successful integration of also quite a group.
Thank you. I mean, I think in the last two rounds, the key sentence that I have got is outcome is very diverse in both sense. I mean, in both terms of the migration development linkage and with regard to integration. So in the last round, maybe we can focus more on the future directions. I mean, maybe I should say the lessons learned from this migratory space that has been created over the 60 years. Because, I mean, although I'm aware of the fact that the nature of the migrations are totally different, there is a discussion going on in the Turkish context, the fact that the Syrians were actually considered temporary initially, but I mean, you know, they are all under temporary protection regime, but the fact that that temporariness is never defined and their stay in Turkey is becoming permanent, there might be lessons learned from the Turkey-Germany migration space, and maybe we can focus more on that now, like the future directions. Also, there were questions about the coming up elections in Germany. Maybe we can also focus on that.
I should come in, or?
Yes, please, Hocam.
Okay, what type of lessons we can learn from this 60 years experience? The first thing, repeatedly, we came to the point of that and this starts as a kind of temporary moment, but turn a kind of long-term settlement, even the permanent one. This story tells me that although the states claims that they can plan or they can intervene, they can plan, they can manage, they can govern the migratory flows, there are limits for that. Okay, just this the main story, maybe one of the main conclusion could be that, because at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that for instance, in 1961, when this agreement signed, and when the workers started arriving in Germany, neither Germany, the government, German society, nor Turkish society, Turkish government, and nor those migrants themselves could think about that one day some of them, even many of them, a large portion of them will be German citizens, for instance. Okay, just this is really remarkable change. Now we know that even in the parliament there's a representation of this by the Turkish migrants. Even some of the politicians just became the party leaders. So this shows that one thing I repeat, that whether the states can plan the migration and to what extent they can plan, we should put a kind of question mark out of that. Second thing, we can mention that we are living in a very different world now. Okay, when we compare the 60s and now, in terms of the global relations, international relations, how we perceive the world, economy, totally different world we are living in. For instance, last 20 years, we use the concept of transnational spaces. Okay, let me mention a bit that, which means that actually this refers that we should look at the whole phenomena beyond the concept of nation state. even I will give a kind of concrete example that, for instance, think about the calculation of remittances, okay? Now, from Germany, before the COVID or after COVID, even during the COVID, there are so many flights coming, okay? And the people bringing some, in their pocket, they can bring money, okay? Just in the 1960s, this travel, 70s, which was rare on that. Even calculation, I mean, this is a kind of how the informal way of bringing remittances, even calculation of remittances change over that. Actually, Rinus mentioned that probably now in the future also increasingly, the agents of migrants and their environment will be very important. Just to perceive what will happen in the future, plus what is going on now, rather than focusing on of course, together with focusing on the states, both German and Turkish state, the role of the agents of the migrants in terms of integration, in terms of relation between these two countries, as I mentioned, that, for instance, even imagine that in the 1960s, probably political activism, or early 1960s I'm talking about. Of course, there were, even in the 60s, there were political activists going to Germany, but in terms of a kind of larger groups, civil society activism, they were very rare in those years, but now it's very, very common. What is clear that now there will be, and so for a long time we realized that as I'm using a kind of as a generic term, there will be minority communities of Turks in Europe overall. We know that Germany is a good example, and we are talking about the third and fourth generation is emerging. Although these communities are quite diverse, I mean, there are different groups, but we see also time to time we are just, of course, critical of those processes of the integration, but also there are social mobility going on. We should not underestimate that. But particularly in the Turkish-German case, the issues are also very, very much politicized, particularly when we look at the last 2 decades, even earlier, as I mentioned, that because of the Kurdish question and the Islamist groups, they are organizing themselves in European countries. These diaspora communities, to certain extent, were maybe involvement of the individuals, we cannot talk about that, the huge, large groups involving that, but still, in terms of its effect, the politicization of these communities are very important. We see that in the particularly last couple of years because of for instance, external voting became important and became a kind of visible. Previously, there was no external voting. So the Turkish citizens living there, they can participate into the elections in Turkey, and the current government very much quite aggressively developed a kind of various type of diaspora policies. I think, again, based on what is going on Turkey in the coming years, we will see that the politicization of the Turkish communities there, both in Germany and elsewhere. But we should probably, today we spent quite large time to these early stages of migration, temporary migration, how Turkish and the German government planned this migration. Now the situation is quite different. Probably in the coming years, we will talk about less and less that origin, how this temporariness was effective, but more and more this transformation happened in the Turkish communities, Turkish migrant communities. I'm referring to Turkish migrant communities, but the Turkey-originated migrant communities, I should say, because just referring to my earlier word, of course, for instance, the Kurdish movement is very active. Also, those Kurds originated from Turkey, and their activism also quite visible. Let me a bit link to this. Already we sent some references. The discussion now in Turkey related to Syrians, time to time, even while we are discussing the Syrians in Turkey, there are references, scholars, researchers, journalists, politicians sending reference to the migrant communities living abroad. There are comparisons made how this temporariness issue turning to the permanency, political activism, etc. So I think also internally in Turkey, we can draw some conclusions from the experience of the Turkish migration to Germany, as Turkey also turning into a kind of country of immigration. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you, John.
Okay. I'll try first to answer the question about German-Turkish transnational space and how I see that for the future. What I've tried to make clear in the course of time in our discussion is that what started as a very specific labor migration thing has grown into a system of relations between Germany and Turkey, in which the number of people involved is huge, is very diverse, in which the relations that have come into existence have been very diverse. Think of German tourism to Turkey or whatever, cultural relations. There has been a parallel development. The labor migration system has become a system of relations which connects the two countries much more. And that also means two things. On the one hand, you may have troubles when some of these extreme movements, either in Germany or in Germany, have consequences at the other side, and you don't have direct means to do so. But the other thing is that, in general, there are more checks and balances on non-democratic extremism at both sides, I would say, because there are so many of these connections. We don't see that because we see only the trolls. But because there are such diverse interest groups that are connected to each other, and these interests are different, and with these extreme things that happen sometimes in Turkey and sometimes in Germany that seem to damage these relations significantly, there at the same time are a lot of checks and balances into that system that keeps them into things. That's how I look at it. If they would have been, let's say, less diverse, etc., there would be less of a checks and balances, and that's politically, that's culturally, that's economically, etc. The two countries are so interwoven and prominently through their population exchange, actually, that they are dependent also, and the checks and balances work for the two. So that's what I want to say on the first question. The question, what it means for Syrian migration to Turkey at the moment. The first thing I would say is that the driving force behind this migration was different than the labor migration. So that's quite clear. These Syrians did not arrive because they wanted to work in Turkey. They came there because they wanted to be away from Syria. And they wanted to be, as long as conditions in Syria are as bad as that. that means that their orientation is by definition, again, the same as for guest workers, temporary, and the same holds for Turkish society. It's prepared to take them in temporary in the hope and expectation that this problem will solve. The problem is that if you stress too much this temporary thing and it doesn't turn out to be, then the definition of temporariness may have negative consequences for the long-term situation of this group. So my advice would be that there's no problem of, in the first stage of urgency, defining this as a temporary solution, but know that in practice it may turn out into a more permanent. And that means that do not, let's say, overstress the temporariness or enforce them at a certain moment, because it works against you and it works against the future of these in all cases. So my conclusion is you can't influence the thing basically because it depends too much on the political developments in the country of origin. You know, that may, if things would be rearranged in such a way that they would have confidence to return, most of them would do, no doubt. We are so short in this thing. But if you ask me 15 years later, when a lot of children have been born to these people and they are still in Turkey, and they had to manage their situation, and every migrant tries to get the best situation possible within these environments, then the answer could be different. So my advice is we should accept, as Turkey did, of course, most of these, and there's no problem for me in doing that in a way as a temporary thing, but don't have the illusion that you can make it temporary, and don't make it temporary because that has adverse consequences for what happens in case a return is not possible. That's what I would say as a lesson.
Yeah. Thank you, Rinus. Now that I think we have covered all the questions that I had in mind, and we are almost towards the end of our time. Maybe we can stop the recording so that the audience can direct their questions. Maybe I can do it. Yes, I think I can.